My name is Jose Perez. I'm the host for RPA and Intelligent Automation Live, and very glad to have already 3 terrific presentations today from industry leaders. And the last presentation for today's segment is another great industry leader with a very practical approach to intelligent automation and RPA, to the work that he is doing with his organization. So please welcome Matthew Marino, the Director of Service Optimization for Prudential Insurance. And Matt is a Lean Six Sigma Black Belt, holds an MS from Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Operations Analytics, and also has completed MIT certificate program in Machine Learning and Artificial Intelligence. Matt is going to have a very practical talk with us. There will be no slides. It will just be Matt talking about his perspectives on the topic. And the topic that he's going to discuss is cutting through the noise. How can you use AI solutions to drive excellence now? So without further ado, Matt, great to have you with us. I'll let you have the stage.
Thank you so much, Jose. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for letting me speak to you today. As Jose stated, I'm Matt Marino, currently with Prudential in the role of Director for Service Optimization. A lot of my work here, as well as in prior organizations, is focused heavily on driving digital transformation, heavy emphasis on process automation. So I'm happy to be able to speak to you today about what I found helpful regarding how to apply intelligent automation to drive results. I'll also share with you some of the challenges that I've encountered along the way that you may have as well, or that you may in the future, with the hope that I may be able to help you avoid some of the same struggles. To that end, I'll say that I suspect we all have at least one thing in common, and that's that no one seems to have all the answers in this space that's growing and evolving so quickly. This is going to really be about my experiences, what I've learned, what I've observed. And I'd love to learn from you guys as well. So if you're willing, please reach out to me on LinkedIn. Would love to maintain contact. I think, I'm loving this virtual forum, but I do miss the networking. So if there's opportunities for us to stay connected, I'd love to engage with all of you. So going into this notion of intelligent automation, one of the things that I wanted to do was kind of define scope. I thought this was a really well-worded verse in terms of what this is. I got this from Edgeverb. But that RPA is the automation of rule-based repetitive tasks, whereas intelligent automation then applies things like artificial intelligence, related technologies such as computer vision, cognitive automation, and machine learning to make intelligent decisions, thereby improving accuracy and eliminating errors. I would say that I think that's really comprehensive. The one thing that I would add, I think OCR and NLP, you could argue that they fall into some of those categories. I think a lot of the technologies that you are familiar with that you may already be leveraging, though, really recognize them as standalone capabilities as well. But all under this notion of how can we broaden our toolkit. I'm going to make reference throughout this conversation about a toolkit, but how can we broaden our toolkit so that when we are looking to drive outcomes, when we are looking at re-engineering a process, we want to have a broader set of capabilities. A lot of us are coming in. When I think about the operational excellence perspective, a lot of us are coming in really looking at process reengineering. These tools in the right format, right environment, really can bring the work that we do much further than we ever could have done when just looking at process alone. I think some of the speakers earlier hit on some of the benefits in terms of being able to drive some technology innovation, really being able to drive a synergy. But being able to do so at a lower cost than what some of our traditional technological implementations would have required. All these capabilities, I would say, have evolved over time. They're in very different states of maturity. Things like OCR technology I've been using for the better part of the last 15 to 20 years when I think about scanning, indexing, some basic screen scrape capabilities. And then you look at things like AI, where I think a lot of what we're seeing today, both in the conversations that we've heard as well as when we look at the various articles that are out there, a lot of it is the aspirational piece. A lot of controlled experiments that are being done within the education space, academia, but in terms of the practical application and the end of the world as we know it has Elon Musk has shared his perspectives on. I think we can recognize that most organizations haven't felt that level of transformation just yet. But I think that's the question is with these early successes, I do think that the sky's the limit when we think about the potential of what these tools, when used properly, when used in conjunction with one another, may be able to do for our enterprises. So when I thought about, what's the utopian, view, this end of the world as we know it, machines taking over, it was hard for me to come up with a real concrete example. And then this morning when I went out to get coffee, I actually got one. It might not have transformed my life, but if I think about what happened this morning, I got in my car and my cell phone immediately asked me if I was going to my usual stop for coffee. And it was willing to pop up, the directions if I needed them. It was willing to allow me not to take the directions if I didn't want them, but could give me an ETA based on traffic. That's ridiculous. If we think about how different that is than years past where GPS didn't exist, where intelligence, pattern recognition, machine learning, etc., wasn't identifying patterns in the data to predict my actions and suggest outcomes. It's amazing how far things like that have come. So when I think about that utopian state, there are bits and pieces where, if I was to articulate my utopian state, it would be that a customer inquiry across any channel is anticipated and or proactively provoked, that the proactive solutions in the anticipated channel of choice are identified. So again, really making this about the customer. And that decision-making for the customer is virtually automated with relevant options provided, irrelevant options excluded, and that the customer leaves the experience feeling wowed, delighted, and becomes an ambassador of your company. So when I already think about, what I've heard this morning and what, I think is a little bit different is I'm not a technologist. I don't code the programs, the various tools that I use, but I do orchestrate how those tools become part of enabling a better overall outcome through process reengineering and, like I mentioned, the notion of a toolkit. But I have learned enough to be dangerous from technology. So when I think about that utopian state, what has to happen in order for our systems to be able to provide that type of experience that I just described to you? So there's a couple of things that I took from the MIT program in terms of what are core competencies, if you will, that AI offers up. And if you think about what I just described to you, one thing is that the systems, in order to just hit that utopian environment, they would need to classify. They need to understand and interpret who I am and what people like me like. They also need to be able to anticipate or predict. So thinking predictive analytics, what might I want? What might I do? What might I have a propensity for? And then when they talk about refining options, so that we're, filtering out the irrelevance, inferring and interpreting, that, the combination of classification, predictive analytics, to be able to really serve up what is the most relevant, refined offering. And to me, what I just described to you is really, in a nutshell, the potential that some of these tools may have. That goes beyond automation. It really goes to a very different experience that a customer or your customers could look forward to in the future. And that to me is what I think is, the holy grail. And I'm not sure that any of us are fully there yet, but that's at least, what I would aspire to see my customers experience for the organizations that I've been a part of. What I just described to you, though, while I would say that I haven't seen, examples where that is consistently provided across all processes, across any one single enterprise, I would also argue that there's a case to be made that none of this is new. What I just described to you 10 years ago was called customer segmentation, predictive analytics, and next best action. So when I think about that, even when I get into, for those that are into the actual AI, the development of algorithms, bag of words, I would argue, is no different than workloads. There's a lot of things that are evolving. The software is more powerful than ever. The availability of data, the ability to actually pull data in from third-party sources. So there's a lot more complexity that can be solved for, but I would say that there's a lot that's similar. And the reason why I share this isn't because I don't believe that the promise of the future isn't incredibly different than what we've experienced today. It's actually the opposite. I do think that these tools are more powerful than ever. I think the availability of data is far greater than ever before, and that these tools will drive very different results. But I think sometimes we get caught up, and it's probably a bias that we have based on the professions that we're part of. But we love these buzzwords. We get caught up in these, and we're scaring the heck out of folks. Like when we look at, the various news articles, we talk about, what could go wrong, and there should always be a level of ethics. There should always be, an understanding of what these machines are capable of. But at the same time, I think what we're doing is scaring the heck out of our employees, our customers, and if you think about what's going on around us, unfortunately, with unemployment rates being higher than I've ever seen them before, it's a really difficult world that we're in right now. It was already challenging from a change management perspective. Again, the more things change, the more things stay the same. This is, to me, no different. If anything, it doubles down on our obligation to address change management when we're getting into how these tools can be leveraged, what it means for the employee. If I think about some of the things many of us have learned when we think about lean, there's a respect for the employee. This shouldn't be a headcount elimination piece, and there's a lot of things that need to be done in parallel to bring folks along. So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I've seen for signs of success. At a high level, a lot of the work that I've been part of, whether it's been in the insurance, financial, other industries, there's a lot of work that we still have coming in for a number of different reasons, but coming in via paper. So when we talk about being able to stack tools together, a lot of the OCR tools are now being brought along much further in terms of the accuracy they can project, leveraging machine learning. Stacking OCR with tools like RCA allows us to go a lot further than we previously could in terms of being able to automate data entry and rules-based processing. I think RPA is probably, when we think about some of the capabilities that have been discussed today, certainly compared to things like computer vision, things like artificial intelligence or machine learning, RPA is further along. But I can share, with you guys, an anecdote that I've experienced. When we first started using RPA tools, one of the things that we heavily emphasized was this notion of repetitive tasks. That's still a valid statement. But the way we went about soliciting repetitive tasks is now very different. Previously, we were looking for the copying and pasting. We were looking for repetitive motion, really like that, I'll say almost archaic time series study, time motion study type activity to really target opportunities. Now we're recognizing, if you actually look at what RPA tools can do and you reimagine the process, and we're going to start talking about this in a moment, but how this becomes part of the toolkit, you can do a lot more with RPA than the copying and pasting replacements. And I think there's some really great examples that were shared earlier today. I'll talk to you guys a little bit about how we've started to change our fundamental approach to building out our RPA portfolio. Process mining tools. So again, this to me is something that's more of an evolving technology. It came from the need of a lot of organizations invested in RPA, then couldn't find the right use cases. There's a lot that's been done in the last few years around process mining. I would also suggest that process mining, again, similar to the RPA anecdote, there's a lot more that those process mining tools can do. Many organizations don't have process controls in place to actually ensure that the new processes are being followed. That was touched on by the prior speaker. Process mining tools not only can identify the opportunities to accelerate the identification of RPA opportunities, as well as the development of those, they can also be used to confirm that the happy path is being followed, identify where deviations exist, and allow for a management system to be built around that. And then obviously, when you think about what some of these new tools are doing, and I think the conversations around the medical space are a really great example. I see a lot of that in the insurance space, where there's a lot of new abilities that are emerging through machine learning and AI around how we can classify unstructured data. You know, for those that have been in the RPA space, structured, unstructured data has always been a challenge to work through. The idea that we're able to now take unstructured data and form insights, that's transformational, or potentially transformational. I think the examples that were shared earlier match a lot of what I've seen, what I've heard in various engagements, which is they're still new. Our test data is still relatively small, but it's a great way of identifying and surfacing things to look into. So it becomes a digital assist in many cases instead of a true end-to-end straight-through processing. But if and I think that's one of the lessons that I've learned is that we don't always have to have 100% automation to claim success. How do we find the bits and pieces that do make sense, that drive greater outcome, especially at scale? So when I think about that last point that I just touched on, I think that challenges a little bit of what a lot of us may have previously looked at when thinking about process reengineering and the risk of sub-optimization. There are many different tools out there that are niche-based. So I'll use a call center as an example. There are tools out there that are not necessarily in the same vendor, not necessarily the same platform, that can be used to predict where the call should be routed, that can automate the authentication experience, that can serve up next best action. When we think about process reengineering, a lot of us, I certainly had this bias, always looked for end-to-end solutions, always looked to the upstream, downstream processes and ensured a comprehensive approach. And what I think we're finding now, and it's exciting, but it may challenge us, is that the tools that are doing the best in this space may require us to think about those individual steps within the process, may require us to become comfortable with increased complexity by introducing many tools instead of one or two, but potentially introducing many tools to be able to really improve the process across each and every step. That's not a bad thing. It does require a very different mindset, though. In terms of openness, it also requires us to be thinking in the terms of axiomatic design principles so that upstream and downstream failures don't occur or are minimized and mitigated because we weren't accounting for I'll say the connective tissue that's required across those. I think what we're going to see evolve in this industry, again, world according to me, I think today we're seeing organizations that are most successful are using best-in-class solutions. I think ultimately we would love to see best-in-suite solutions, and I think as this is such a new market that it's probably too early to say that any one of us has a best-in-suit solution that spans across front office, back office, and the various complexities of the individual steps that get taken. In terms of things that I've seen, as hardships or challenges, and this will kind of become, a little bit inverse when we talk about best practices, but this, I think this was touched on earlier today. This notion of no code and low code, I love it. I'll start by saying that I love it. And it does allow, in some cases, for us to do things faster than we could previously have done. I also recognize that speaking with a couple of vendors that I've either leveraged or that I've engaged in consulting engagements with, one of the things that I often hear is that their sales process stops because, quote, the CIO stopped them. And one of the questions that I asked, and they kind of smiled when I said this, is, why are you guys selling into us? These are technology solutions. These require, at a minimum, there's a tremendous amount of integration that's required in order for these to be successful. There's all sorts of user acceptance testing. Like, this is a technology platform. And for us to be coming in, when we think about change management, when we think about our roles as advocates of reengineering and change, we always try to disarm. We always try to come with an appreciation, respect for those that have done the work prior, to be an advocate for them, not come and tell them how they're broken and how we can fix them. And when I put myself in a CIO's shoes, if somebody from the operations team comes to me and says your systems can't do this, we can now solve it for you, and even better, we don't even need you, we're going to use a business analyst to do it, I can understand why the CIO is not loving and embracing that. No different than if I went into any operations group and said, I think you guys could do better, and here's how, and nobody even asked for my insight. So I think, when we talk about change management, when I think about questions that were raised earlier, I think, at the beginning of this, we have to understand what is the technology roadmap, what is the end state vision, how does this become part of it, and that direction really needs to be set from the very top, the C-suite, so that these automation tools are part of their toolbox, so to speak, and that they know that they both have a seat at the table and they can help direct things. Other issues that I think that are relatively common is this notion of the flexibility that these tools offer, especially when you start talking about things like machine learning, Python, Scikit. There's so many tools out there and that are easily available. There's a challenge there. Domain expertise, whether it's the technical expertise to actually successfully leverage those tools, or the business expertise that's required to understand the nuances. And I'll give you an example from the insurance perspective. There are a lot of data points that we need to exclude from our decisioning in order to meet regulatory requirements. If we throw this data into a black box and the black box gives us an answer back, no matter how good that answer is, if that answer is violating, or we can't demonstrate that it is not violating any of those biases that are illegal, we're breaking the law. We're violating our principles. We're unethical. Certainly none of those things are good. So when I think about challenges, how do you make sure that you have the right people in the room on top of the technologists, on top of the data scientists, along with the relevant domain expertise to be able to leverage these tools in a way that doesn't hurt us. So again, we'll talk a little bit about how to organize for success. And I think that's where we want to talk about talent. These are new tools. I don't want to say that there's a build versus buy bias, but unless you've invested, a lot of organizations that are starting out on this journey won't have the talent day one. That talent is expensive to procure, so to speak. So I do think when we talk about the organizations that set themselves up for success early on, there probably is a tendency to buy, not build, so that you're able to really stack the deck in your favor and be able to drive success, be able to drive credibility to your program, and then you can think about how do we scale these beyond individual use cases. So I'm going to go through a real quick list around suggestions, and then I'm going to turn it over for questions. But in terms of suggestions to drive success, one, I've touched on this. Establish a transformation strategy that absolutely articulates where and how intelligent automation and those tools are part of it. That should be done at the CEO, CIO, COO, CTO, you name it, at that C-suite, so that there's not a lack of alignment, that there's not a fear or risk that we're stepping into somebody else's sandbox, and that we're, our success or lack thereof requires alignment. If we don't have it, we will not be successful. I'll say that is almost a certainty. Communicate. So whether it's within those teams, because this is a change for them, but certainly to our employees, communicate what is the reason for this, change, this need for change. Reinforce that we're going to test and learn. Be transparent that these transformations, these tools, don't always plug in and work as advertised. Don't be surprised by that failure, and don't hide that failure. Be transparent with it. But when you think about being transparent with it, be transparent around root cause. What went wrong? And when we go back to try it a second time, why do we think things will be different? We don't want it to be the definition of insanity of doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, but really believe that these are new tools. They're not designed specific to your environment. They're designed for broad environments. And just because one tool doesn't work, it may not be the tool. It may be. It may not be the person or the programmer. It may be. But look to really identify what your root cause is, share that broadly, so that people are able to support and line up and advocate for success. The other thing is also around the employee disruption. Recognize people are scared. No different than I'll say general change management, but probably amplified. Make sure that you're building a vision for growth. These tools can make roles more interesting as opposed to simply being eliminated. There's a lot of ways when we think about future of work, there's a lot of ways to be planning for the success of these tools, planning for transition plans, so that employees are recognizing that this is being thought about and it's being thought about in a way that's respectful to them. I mentioned this earlier, stack the deck. Don't try to solve world hunger. Don't bite off more than you can chew. And don't try to deploy these technologies for the first time with limited experience in use cases that no other organization has ever been successful with. Start small, figure out where there has been success, replicate best practice. That would be my advice. And I know that may be less than ambitious, but it's about starting off, getting some wins, getting credibility, and earning your right to innovate. That would be my thought. And again, I think there's a bias there of being a little bit risk averse, but also recognizing that there's a risk that we throw the baby out with the bathwater if these early engagements aren't successful. Don't let that happen to your program. Organize for success, and this is going to be, I'll say the big one around how do we tie this into process. I do not believe personally that RPA, AI, machine learning is any different than any of the tools in the Lean Six Sigma toolkit. We don't run around trying to find a use case for an FMEA. We don't run around trying to find a use case for a SIPOC. We shouldn't run around trying to find a use case for RPA. That's my opinion. When I think about the reasons why for that, we should be designing processes to an aspirational capability. In order to do so, we shouldn't be automating existing current process. We should be evaluating that existing current process to determine really, is it delivering everything we could ever aspire for it to do? At a minimum, check that box. In most cases, you'll find that there's things that could be improved. And there's things that if you now understand what these tools can do, that could be refined or modified to really enable that process to be well set up, to be enabled for digital transformation, to be enabled for these tools. Things like, where can we get to structured data more easily? Are there things that are in text boxes that could more easily be formatted? Things along those lines. E-signatures instead of digital wet signatures. All sorts of things will allow for you to think about that end-to-end process differently. And in order to do that, when I think about this, I'll say that the structure that I've seen work best, it's not about org structure, it's not about moving people into different roles or hierarchies, but having resources from start to finish that recognize that come from like an IT architecture background, that come from the business domain background, that come from the continuous improvement background, and quite often, though not always the case, come from an HR background. If we're talking about the potential of a complete re-engineered process that drastically changes what the employee is doing, HR has to have a seat at the table. It's not uncommon to see roles go from exempt to non-exempt as we take away some of the monotony of data entry and we more heavily emphasize decision-making. Things like that, are really important to make sure that, again, we're building out a comprehensive solution end-to-end that supports it. And most importantly, business sponsorship. Again, I go back to change management. When the leader of that operation area is your champion, that's there to remove obstacles, that's there to drive alignment, that's there to connect you to the customer, that goes a lot further than, again, traditional CI, where we've, many of us have stumbled where some of our CI programs were more heavily, organized around financial outcomes. Finance clearly has a seat at the table in terms of benefits, but if we're known as the Grim Reaper and these tools, magnify that fear, it's going to be very difficult to get the domain expertise and business support. And then last but not least, I'll say, as your capability matures, a lot of what I just described is about getting your program off the ground, trying to set yourself up for success and stacking the deck. But more large, moving forward as you've earned that opportunity, start setting, the BHAG, the bold, hairy, audacious goal, drive significant challenges, in terms of what you're looking to accomplish, and really be aspirational. It forces you to get out of the box. Design for digital, so I touched on this one already, but recognize that before you start automating your process, you want to improve it as far as you can, even with the understanding and the lens of what can the machines now do with these various capabilities to go further than what process improvements alone would do. And then last but not least, management and process controls and sustaining the gain. I would suggest that, this is a challenge for organizations. And, I think the last speaker, made a really good point that a lot of the project teams disband and move on. How do we sustain the gain? And a lot of the things that you're going to gain will not be end-to-end automation. So you must, in my opinion, have process controls in place, whether that be manual through, the go and sees in the 5 lens model, although, that can be manual, time, consuming and challenging, or as I mentioned, thinking about how process mining tools may be used differently to drive things in a more meaningful way. So with that, those were my, I'll say structured comments, but I really wanted to make sure that you guys had a chance to, ask me questions. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Jose to share those with me. Okay, I just see a note.
Matt, let me step in here a moment. Apologies, Jose is having some issues with his video and audio. So if you could bear with us for 30 seconds or so, we'll try and sort this out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, in the interim, Matt, while we try to do this, there's a couple of quick questions which we've got up here. One from Binu.
I just lost your audio if you're still speaking.
Yeah, Binu, sorry about that, Matt.
No.
Binu had a question for you. What will be your strategy in the case you had to justify benefits of automation initiatives where there is no FTE stroke cost release in the first year of implementation?
So I think that, so great question. I'm going to answer it 2 different ways. If the question is specific around no benefits in terms of first year, meaning that the investment cost is greater than year 1 recovery, we normally look at 5-year business cases. I'll say most of the organizations I've worked with, at a minimum, it's 3 years. Most companies, it's 5. So, part of it is just looking out across the time horizon is one. I think the other way of answering that question, just to knowing that it could come from a couple of different directions, is about the soft benefits around customer experience. I will tell you that a former organization that I worked with, when we look at customer experience, when we attach value of customer experience to things like retention, to things like propensity for upsell, more often than not, the value that comes from increased experience is actually higher than what we see for operational expense reduction. So I think there's 2 ways of thinking about that, whether it's about the horizon or whether it's about, softer benefits. I would suggest, and this comes just from my experience with being able to get investment dollars, at the end of the day, unless you really have an organization that is truly just trying to learn, and this is purely nothing more than a learning experience, it's going to be really hard to get investment dollars without being able to articulate why you're doing this. But I do think that there's a strong value there in terms of learning and being able to tell that story in the context of, we believe we could save X million of dollars if we were able to successfully do the following. and we want to have a use case. And the reason why we're following, using this use case, even though it doesn't provide tangible benefit, is for the learning experience, and it's a proof of concept. And a lot of the vendors that are out there, that's a very low investment threshold that could be required to make that as kind of the third angle, if you will.
Thank you for that, Matt. Hopefully, Benu, that goes some way to answering your query. Following on from that, Erwin has a question around which processes or activities do you approach currently with the highest priority in your transformation program within the insurance business?
Yeah, so I think that, the common thread that I'll say that I've heard and that I've observed both with the places I've worked for as well as those that I speak with, it's about maximizing value, whether that be true dollars saved, whether that be revenue gained, or whether that be customer experience. So usually, when you're looking for that, there's an order of magnitude. So when we think about filters that can be put on to identify the best opportunities, where are we spending the most? Where are we have the opportunity to wow the customer the most? Where do we have the opportunity to remove defects the most? Those types of measures help a lot to identify the process, and then looking for patterns within that process in terms of how suitable are they for various technologies. So if it's highly repetitive, if it's documented, if there's low variation, all of a sudden you have a really compelling candidate for success. And quite, the opposite can easily be, inferred as well. A lot of insurance organizations, as an example, customize their plans, customize their offerings. Those rules aren't necessarily structured. So being able to apply automation in those environments brings additional complexity. So I would say it's a combination of that aspirational benefit case, the lens of feasibility, and that really puts a good filter on where you can start. And like I mentioned, some of the process mining tools out there are incredible in terms of how they can sift through the vast organization, the vast number of processes, and really put that sizing on there in a way that I'll say traditional Excel exercises with budgets quite honestly doesn't.
Thank you, Matt. That's hopefully, Erwin, that provides you with some insight that you were looking for. And finally, I have a question from David Turner, who's asking you, Matt, what do you mean when asked why these no-code, low-code solutions were being sold to us?
Yeah, so one of the things that I was actually just having this conversation this past weekend. So one of the things that was interesting to me was this person runs a sales organization for a company that sells automation tools, and he was lamenting the fact that where his deals go south is when the CIO or somebody in the senior levels of IT says no. And the question that I had asked him, and it was funny because we had a really good dialogue about this, but the question that I asked him was, why wouldn't the CIO support the recommendations of their staff? And he bounced back to me, well, I'm not working with their staff, I'm working with operations. And he then started to espouse this notion that these low-code, no-code solutions allow for teams like ours. And when I say teams like ours, teams of process engineers and very much Lean Six Sigma black belts, business SMEs, that we should in their sales model be empowered to deploy these tools. And I laughed and said, and I didn't mean that, as I say that, I have to understand this is my brother-in-law, so I laughed. It wasn't meant to be disparaging or condescending, but what I was laughing at was this notion that in the environments that I've worked for, so again, everybody's unique situation applies, but I've worked for mostly Fortune 500 companies that have tremendous rules and boundaries around what goes on in our operation within our technology environments. The idea that I could single-handedly, and I would have been, according to him, I was like his key demographic. I would have been who they would be, pinging, and I'm sure most of us are getting these invites on a regular basis through LinkedIn and others. I would be the key demographic that he would target, and he would expect, build the relationship, sell me on what their tools can do, and then at the end of the day, for me to bring in a technology tool, that goes through the technology procurement team. That goes through Enterprise Application Resource Board. There's a lot of architectural standards that need to be met that I know nothing about, or that I knew nothing about prior to partnering with them in these roles. But the idea that the operations teams should be making these, these are strategic technological decisions. Not that we shouldn't be part of them, and not that we aren't the biggest benefits from having them, but we're certainly, in the experiences that I've had, we're not the decision maker. So it's not that I have nothing against those solutions whatsoever, but I think some of the vendors are struggling because they're selling into us because they know we're advocates, they know we can see the value of it, but they're not necessarily always recognizing at the end of the day, we're really not the decision maker for some of these tools and how it fits into the reference architecture that's envisioned from our CIO level.
And Matt, thank you for that. David, hopefully that provides the answer you were looking for. If not, and you would like to take this further, I'm sure that offline, Matt would be very willing to continue the conversation. The same with anybody's in there. Not wanting to preempt that at all, Matt.
Excellent.
Okay, Matt, thank you so much. Really appreciated an excellent closing presentation for the first day of the conference. Really appreciate you getting involved, and I wish you all the best for the rest of the day.
Thank you.
Now, in terms of the summit, that's the end of the first day. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow, bright and early at 8:45 Eastern Standard Time for the day 2. If you have any queries or questions, please don't hesitate to drop us a line. Once the webinar has closed out, please don't hesitate to leave us your feedback for day 1, and look forward to catching up with you all for day 2. Take care and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.